My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Red and blue lights filled my rearview mirror. "Step out of the car." "Ma'am," the officer said. 3 weeks earlier. None of this made sense. A woman I barely knew wanted my Mustang gone. Then she wanted it for herself. 6 months later, everything I thought I knew collapsed. What I didn't know was who my father really was. My name is Madison Cole, and the car in question was a 1969 Ford Mustang Fastback. Highland green. The last thing my grandfather Walt ever gave me before he passed. I was 29, an ER nurse in Millbrook Heights, Ohio, and that car sat in my driveway like a piece of him still breathing. I lived alone in the house Grandpa left me too. A modest 2-story on Cedar Hollow Lane inside Willow Creek Estates. A gated community with manicured lawns, matching mailboxes, and an HOA that took itself far too seriously. I worked nights, slept days, and mostly kept to myself. I didn't ask for trouble. Willow Creek Estates had one queen bee, Deborah Ashcroft, HOA president for 11 years running, unopposed because nobody wanted the headache of running against her. She had opinions about everyone's lawn height, mailbox paint, and holiday lights, and she delivered them with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. Deborah drove a white Cadillac Escalade with a "Proud HOA President" bumper sticker, which told you everything about her before she opened her mouth. She'd corner neighbors at the mailbox to remind them of rules nobody remembered agreeing to. People smiled and nodded just to make her leave. I'd met her exactly twice before the Mustang came into it. Once at a welcome committee visit where she eyed my grandfather's antique furniture like she was appraising it, and once when she left a passive-aggressive note about my trash cans being visible 11 minutes too long past pickup. I didn't think much of her beyond mild annoyance. Willow Creek had 30-some houses, and everyone had a Deborah story. She'd fined the Pattersons for a garden gnome. She'd sued the Ferraros over a fence color. People joked that crossing Deborah Ashcroft was worse than crossing a mob boss. What people didn't joke about, because they didn't know, was that Deborah controlled every dollar in the HOA's reserve account, and had for over a decade, with almost no oversight, since board elections were a formality and audits were handled internally, meaning handled by her. My grandfather, Walt Cole, had lived in Willow Creek since it was built, long before Deborah's reign began. He kept that Mustang in immaculate condition in his garage for 40 years, rebuilding the engine himself twice. He used to say a car like that was a promise you made to your younger self. What I didn't know yet was that Deborah had tried, twice, to buy that exact car from my grandfather years before he died. He turned her down cold both times. She never forgot things like that. Deborah Ashcroft collected grudges the way other people collected china. When Grandpa passed, I inherited the house and the car outright. I drove the Mustang maybe twice a week, careful, proud, parking it in my driveway under a fitted cover most nights. It wasn't hurting anyone. It wasn't even visible half the time. I thought that would be the end of it. My father, Ray Cole, lived 40 minutes away in Ashford County. We weren't especially close. He'd worked long, unpredictable hours my whole childhood, and after my parents divorced I mostly grew up with my mom. I knew he worked in law enforcement. I didn't advertise it, and I never once mentioned it to my neighbors. That detail would matter more than I could have guessed. But at the time, my father was just Dad, a guy who texted you good once a week and showed up for my birthday with a card he clearly bought at a gas station. Nobody at Willow Creek knew his name, let alone his rank. The Mustang first caught Deborah's attention on a Tuesday morning when I drove it to the grocery store. Top down, sun out. She was walking her poodle and stopped dead on the sidewalk, staring at it like she'd seen a ghost. I waved. That evening, an HOA notice appeared in my mailbox, not emailed like usual, but hand-delivered, folded twice, my name written in looping cursive. Vehicle compliance concern, it read. Something about unauthorized modified vehicles cluttering the neighborhood aesthetic. I almost laughed. Driveways. I called the HOA office the next day, more curious than worried. The woman who answered, Deborah herself, apparently informed me in a saccharine voice that certain vehicles didn't align with Willow Creek's family-friendly image, and that I should consider storing it elsewhere. I told her it was staying exactly where it was. She went quiet on the phone for a second too long. "We'll see," she said, and hung up. I remember standing in my kitchen thinking that was a strange thing to say about a parked car. I had no idea it was the opening move of something much bigger. A week passed with nothing, which should have been my first warning. Deborah Ashcroft did not let things go quietly. I later learned she spent that week combing through the HOA's decade-old bylaws looking for any clause, no matter how obscure, that she could twist into a weapon. The next notice came certified mail, a formal violation, citing a bylaw about non-standard vehicles exceeding 25 years of age, requiring garage storage only. My Mustang, '69 model, definitely qualified as non-standard. The fine was $200, with 50 more accruing weekly until compliance. I read the bylaw 3 times. It existed, technically, buried in a 1998 amendment nobody enforced because half the neighborhood parked boats and RVs on their driveways without issue. I called an emergency meeting request, asking why this rule was suddenly being applied only to me. Deborah's response, in the group HOA email thread everyone could see, was breathtaking. Rules apply to everyone equally. Madison. I'd hate for others to feel singled out by seeing exceptions made. The irony wasn't lost on my neighbors, several of whom quietly messaged me their support. My neighbor Priya, 3 doors down, told me Deborah had tried the same vehicle bylaw trick on the Okafor's minivan years back until their lawyer sent one letter and it disappeared overnight. She backs off when someone pushes, Priya said. She just usually bets people won't. I decided not to push yet. I paid the $200 fine under protest, in writing, and moved the Mustang into my garage at night, keeping it in the driveway only during the day while I was home to supervise it, which wasn't in violation of anything Deborah had cited. That should have ended it. 3 days later, I found a business card tucked under my windshield wiper. Not a violation notice this time, but a card from Whitmore & Sons Classic Auto Restoration, Deborah's maiden name business, apparently run by her adult son Cody. Written on the back in the same looping cursive, might be easier to just sell it. Fair offer. No hassle. I stood in my driveway holding that card for a long time. This was never about the neighborhood's aesthetic. Deborah wanted the car. I didn't respond to the card. I didn't need to sell anything, and I certainly wasn't selling my grandfather's Mustang to the woman who'd been harassing me over it for 2 weeks. I tucked the card in a kitchen drawer and told myself the whole thing was over. It wasn't over. Another certified letter arrived. This one escalating things dramatically. A formal complaint alleging the Mustang was leaking hazardous fluids onto the shared community drainage easement, threatening groundwater contamination. CCING, the County Environmental Office. There was no leak. I photographed the clean, dry driveway that same afternoon, date stamped, and emailed it to the HOA board along with a polite but firm request that Deborah stop filing false reports about my property. I didn't hear back from the board. I heard back from Deborah, personally, within the hour. I have witnesses, she wrote. Multiple neighbors have expressed concern about your vehicle's impact on our community's environmental standards and property values. I asked her to name one witness. She never did. Had said a single word to me about concern. I started keeping a folder. Every notice, every email, every date and time, screenshots of the HOA thread. My ER training had taught me one thing above all else. When something doesn't add up, you document everything before anyone can tell a different version of events later. My friend Renee, a fellow nurse, told me over coffee that it sounded less like an HOA dispute and more like a woman with a plan. People don't fabricate an environmental hazard over a parking spot, she said. She wants that car, and she's building a case to force your hand. I laughed it off at the time, mostly because the alternative was unsettling. Deborah Ashcroft was petty. Sure, everyone in Willow Creek agreed on that. But orchestrating fake complaints and environmental reports over a classic car felt like something out of a soap opera. Not suburban Ohio. I was wrong about how far she'd go. I just didn't know it yet. The environmental complaint fizzled once the county inspector found nothing and closed the file within a week. Small win. Was down between us. Didn't. Instead, Deborah pivoted. At the next scheduled HOA meeting, which I'd never bothered attending before, she stood at the podium and proposed a new community-wide vehicle ordinance, vaguely worded, but clearly aimed at exactly one car in the neighborhood. Mine, requiring all classic or vintage vehicles get board pre-approval. 12 homeowners attended that meeting. 9 of them, including Priya and the Ferraros, voted against the proposal, visibly annoyed at being dragged into Deborah's personal vendetta. Failed. Her wavered, but her knuckles went white gripping the podium. I should have recognized that look for what it was. The failed vote seemed to flip a switch in her. The following week, my mail started arriving opened, resealed with tape. My garbage cans, which I always brought in promptly, were suddenly left out, according to 2 more violation notices with photos I was certain had been staged or dated incorrectly. I installed a doorbell camera. It felt paranoid at the time, spending money to watch my own driveway because of a woman upset about a car. 3 days after installation, the footage showed Deborah's Cadillac idling at the curb at 6 a.m., her walking up my driveway, photographing my garage door. I confronted her that afternoon at the community mailboxes. Calm but direct. I have you on camera in my driveway before sunrise. Deborah. Her face didn't even flicker. I was checking for compliance issues on behalf of the board, she said smoothly, which is well within my authority as president. You don't have authority to trespass on private property, I told her. She smiled that thin smile. We'll let the board decide that, won't we? I realized, standing there, that the board was mostly Deborah's hand-picked friends, her sister-in-law, her golf partner, and a man who owed her a favor. I started researching how HOA boards actually worked, how elections were supposed to function, and discovered Willow Creek hadn't held a contested board election in 9 years. Deborah ran unopposed every single cycle because nomination paperwork mysteriously never arrived for anyone who expressed interest in running. Priya told me she tried running 2 years earlier, and her nomination form had gotten lost in the mail twice. She'd given up rather than fight it. Hearing that made something click for me. This wasn't a woman abusing power over one dispute. This was a system she'd built. I filed a formal records request with the HOA, citing state disclosure laws, asking to see meeting minutes, financial statements, and reserve fund balances going back 5 years. Ohio HOA law required boards to provide this within a set number of days upon written request. I sent it certified mail. Deborah's response came fast. And it wasn't the records. It was a letter accusing me of harassment of board members and threatening to refer the matter to the HOA's legal counsel if I continued this pattern of hostility. I hadn't sent a single hostile word.
Idesen a records recast.
I forwarded everything to Renee's husband, a paralegal, who read through it and went quiet for a minute before saying, "This isn't normal HOA behavior. This is someone panicking about you looking at the books." That was the first time I considered that Deborah might be hiding something bigger than a grudge. I didn't have proof of anything yet, just a feeling and a folder full of increasingly unhinged violation notices. But the records request had clearly rattled her more than the Mustang ever had. That told me something. Read quietly, while she stayed fixated on my car. 2 weeks passed with no financial records provided, well past the legal deadline. I sent a follow-up, CCING the county's HOA oversight office, mentioning the missed deadline explicitly. Deborah's next move surprised me. She suddenly, sweetly, invited me to coffee to clear the air between us. I almost didn't go. Phone. Recording. Tucked visibly on the table so there'd be no question later about consent. Deborah met me at a diner off Route 9, smiling like we were old friends, and slid a folder across the table before I'd even sat down. Inside was a settlement offer. The HOA would drop all outstanding violations and fines if I agreed to relocate the Mustang permanently off Willow Creek property, or alternatively, sell it to a buyer the board could arrange, at a price $20,000 below its actual appraised value. I asked her, plainly, why the HOA cared this much about one car. Her smile finally cracked, just slightly. "Some of us," she said, voice tightening, "remember when that car should have belonged to someone else. Your grandfather made a lot of promises he didn't keep." I felt the floor shift under me. I asked what she meant. Composure snapping back into place. Old history. Doesn't matter now. But it mattered enough that she'd built a 2-month campaign around it. I pushed the folder back across the table, untouched. "I'm not selling my grandfather's car. Ever." She stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor. Diner patrons glancing over. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," she said, low and cold, dropping the sweetness entirely for the first time. Then she walked out, leaving her coffee untouched and the folder still on the table. I sat there for a long moment, recording still running, replaying what she'd said. Your grandfather made a lot of promises he didn't keep. That wasn't about a driveway violation. That was personal, decades old, and buried somewhere in a history I didn't know anything about yet. I called my mother that night, hoping she might remember something about Grandpa and a woman named Deborah. My mom paused, then said slowly, "Ashcroft, wait. Was her maiden name Whitmore? There was a Debbie Whitmore who dated your Uncle Frank for a while, before your grandfather ran her off." My mother didn't remember details, only that it ended badly, that Grandpa had accused Debbie Whitmore of something involving money, and that Frank never spoke to her again. It was 30 years old. Hazy family lore nobody had bothered repeating. But it explained the venom in Deborah's voice at that diner. I couldn't prove any of it connected to the Mustang. Not directly, but the pieces were forming a shape I didn't like. A grudge that old, carried that long, aimed now at me simply because I happened to inherit the one thing that reminded her of a humiliation decades in the past. For a few days, things went quiet. No new notices, no drive-by photography, no diner ambushes. I let myself hope it was over, that maybe Deborah had realized pushing further would only expose her further. I should have known better. Ashcroft only ever meant she was regrouping. The quiet ended on a Thursday morning when I found a tow truck idling in front of my house. Hazards on. The driver checking a clipboard against my address. My stomach dropped before he even said a word. Got a work order here for a Mustang. Non-compliant vehicle removal. I stood in my driveway in scrubs, 10 minutes from a shift, staring at a stranger about to hook chains to my grandfather's car. I demanded to see the work order. It listed the HOA as the requesting party. Signed by Deborah Ashcroft, citing vehicle abandoned on shared community property. My car was parked entirely inside my own driveway, nowhere near shared property, and it had been driven 3 days earlier, hardly abandoned. I refused to let him touch it, called Willow Creek's non-emergency police line myself, and stood between the tow truck and my car until an officer arrived. The responding officer, a young guy named Trent, listened to both sides, checked the paperwork, and ultimately told the tow company they couldn't legally remove a vehicle from private property without either owner consent or a valid court order, which the HOA notice clearly wasn't. The truck left empty. I thanked Officer Trent, relieved, and didn't think much of his last name at the time, Ashcroft, printed neatly on his badge. It didn't click until I mentioned the incident to Priya later that day, and she went pale. "Trent Ashcroft," she said. "That's Deborah's nephew." I felt sick. Shown up to protect my property rights, happened to share blood with the woman trying to steal it. He'd done the right thing that day, legally, but it meant Deborah now had eyes inside the department, however minor his role actually was. I filed a police report of my own that afternoon, documenting the attempted unauthorized tow, the forged work order claiming abandonment, and requested it be added to my growing file. The desk sergeant who took the report seemed unimpressed by HOA drama, but logged everything by the book regardless. That night I sat at my kitchen table with Grandpa's old cigar box of documents, title history, restoration receipts, even a faded photo of him and the Mustang the day he bought it in 1971. I needed to know this car, on paper, belonged to me beyond any doubt Deborah could manufacture. Everything was in order. Transferred to me through probate, notarized, filed with the state. There was no ambiguity, no loophole, nothing Deborah could twist legally. Whatever she was planning next, it wouldn't be about paperwork. It would have to be about something dirtier. I started sleeping with the garage door camera app open on my nightstand, waking at every notification. I hated what this had turned me into. Jumpy, exhausted, suspicious of a woman 2 houses down over a car. But I'd learned by then that underestimating Deborah Ashcroft was a mistake people paid for. A week later, Cody Whitmore, Deborah's son, showed up at my door personally, all fake charm and a restoration company polo shirt, offering one last chance to sell before things got complicated. I told him, politely, to leave. He did, but not before saying, "You should have just taken the deal." I mentioned that comment to Renee's husband, the paralegal, who by now had become something like an unofficial advisor. He frowned. Agent talking. That's someone who knows something is about to happen to you and is giving you a chance to avoid it. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about what complicated meant coming from a family that had already tried fake violations, a rigged HOA vote, a forged tow order, and a diner ultimatum. I had no idea what card Deborah had left to play. I was about to find out. 3 days later, everything changed in the span of one Tuesday afternoon. I came home from a 12-hour ER shift, exhausted, to find 2 patrol cars in front of my house and Deborah standing on my lawn, arms crossed, wearing an expression I can only describe as triumphant. "That's her," Deborah said the moment I stepped out of my car, pointing at me like I was a stranger caught in the act. "That's the vehicle I told you about. She's had it hidden in there for weeks." An officer I didn't recognize approached me, hand near his belt. "Ma'am, we've received a report of a stolen vehicle matching the description of a Mustang registered to this address," he said. My ears started ringing. "Stolen?" "I have the title." He asked me to step aside while they verified the vehicle's registration and ownership history. Deborah stood behind him, arms still crossed, watching me with an expression I'd never forget. Not anger, not smugness even, but something closer to relief, like she'd finally pulled off something she'd been planning for months. That's when I understood. This wasn't spontaneous. This was the plan all along. The officer ran the plates. My registration came back clean, current, matching my name exactly. But Deborah, prepared, produced a folder of her own, a photocopied vehicle bill of sale, dated 15 years earlier, claiming the Mustang had been sold to a Deborah Whitmore by my grandfather, unregistered ever since. The bill of sale looked convincing at a glance, an old font, yellowed paper, a signature that vaguely resembled my grandfather's looping handwriting. I stared at it, stunned, my whole body cold. I had never seen this document in my life. My grandfather had never mentioned selling anything to Deborah Ashcroft. The officer studied it, then studied my clean title, clearly unsure which document held more weight in the moment. "This is going to need to go through detectives," he said finally. "Given the conflicting ownership claims, I need you to come down to the station to sort this out." I felt the world tilt sideways. "You're going to take my car based on a photocopy she just handed you?" He shook his head. Nobody's taking anything today. But given the report of a possible stolen vehicle and conflicting documents, I do need you to come in for questioning. I went, mostly because refusing would have looked worse, and partly because I was too stunned to argue. Deborah watched me get into the back of a patrol car from her front lawn, and I swear, just before the door shut, she smiled at me. A real, satisfied smile. At the station, I sat in a small interview room for nearly 2 hours before a detective came in. A tired-looking man named Osei who read through both documents with visible skepticism. "This bill of sale," he said, tapping Deborah's copy. "You've genuinely never seen this before?" "Never," I said. "My grandfather kept meticulous records. I have the original title, probate documents, restoration receipts going back decades. If he sold that car, there'd be a paper trail somewhere, and there isn't one, because it never happened." Detective Osei nodded slowly, unconvinced either way just yet. "Here's the problem," he said. "On paper, right now, we've got 2 competing ownership claims and no witnesses on either side. Until we sort out authenticity, I'm going to advise you not to move the vehicle, and I'd strongly suggest getting a lawyer involved. This is above a parking dispute now." I left the station that evening with my phone buzzing nonstop. Priya, Renee, even neighbors I barely spoke to, all asking if it was true that police had come for my car. Word traveled fast in Willow Creek, and Deborah, I later learned, had been the one spreading it. By the time I got home, there was already a post in the neighborhood app, written by Deborah herself, framing the entire thing as her difficult but necessary decision to report a long-standing family property dispute to authorities. She turned herself into the reluctant hero of her own manufactured crisis. I sat in my driveway that night, Mustang covered under its tarp, and finally called my father. I hadn't wanted to bother him with what felt like petty neighborhood drama, but a forged document and a police interview weren't petty anymore. "Dad," I said when he picked up, "I need advice." I told him everything: the fines, the fake environmental complaint, the rigged vote, the attempted tow, and now the forged bill of sale. He listened without interrupting, which wasn't like him. When I finished, there was a long pause. "Send me photos of that bill of sale," he said. "Tonight," I did, confused why he suddenly sounded so serious about paperwork rather than the harassment itself. He called back 20 minutes later. "This signature," he said carefully, "doesn't match your grandfather's at all. I'd know his signature anywhere. He co-signed my first car loan with that exact handwriting." I hadn't considered that my father would recognize my grandfather's signature so precisely, but of course he would. Walt Cole had been his father-in-law for over a decade before the divorce, and some things, apparently, you don't forget. "Someone forged this," my father said. "Badly, but deliberately." "What do I do?" I asked, exhausted, scared, half convinced I was about to lose the one physical piece of my grandfather I had left. My father was quiet for a moment. "Let me make a few calls," he said. "Don't sign anything. I'll be there tomorrow." I didn't sleep much that night, running through everything Deborah had done in 2 months, wondering how far someone would really go over an old grudge and a car. I didn't yet understand that the grudge was never really about the Mustang at all. It was about control, and money. My father arrived the next afternoon, still in his off-duty clothes, and the first thing he did was walk the entire property with me, photographing every angle of the Mustang, cross-referencing VIN numbers against the original title and even the restoration receipts from decades ago. He wanted an airtight record. "This car's provenance is bulletproof," he said finally. "Continuous ownership. Documented restoration work under Walt's name. Probate transfer to you. Whoever forged that bill of sale didn't think anyone would actually check this thoroughly. They banked on you folding under pressure before it got this far." I asked him what he meant by someone, since Deborah's name was on the forged document. He gave me a careful look. "I mean, whoever actually wrote it. Forgery isn't usually the forger's first crime. Maddie. People who fake documents tend to have practice. I want to know who taught her that." That comment stuck with me. My father, a man with 30 years in law enforcement, wasn't looking at Deborah as a petty HOA tyrant anymore. He was looking at her like a case, like someone worth investigating properly. I didn't fully understand why until much later that week. 2 days after my father's visit, the HOA sent out a mass email announcing an emergency community meeting to address ongoing property disputes affecting neighborhood harmony. It didn't name me directly, but everyone knew exactly what and who the meeting was really about. I almost didn't go, reminding me that silence would only let Deborah control the narrative uncontested. I walked into the community clubhouse that Thursday night to find nearly 40 homeowners packed into folding chairs, more than had attended any HOA meeting in years. Deborah stood at the podium, composed, dressed sharply, playing wounded community leader to a captive audience. "It pains me," she began, "to bring internal matters into a public forum. But Madison Cole's continued hostility toward this board has left me no choice but to address it directly." She recounted a wildly distorted version of events. My refusal to comply with reasonable vehicle standards. My aggressive confrontation with her at the diner, framing every defensive move I'd made as unprovoked hostility. Several neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Priya caught my eye and gave a small, steady nod. When Deborah finished, she opened the floor, clearly expecting sympathetic murmurs. Instead, an older man near the back, Mr. Ferraro, stood up first. "Deborah," he said evenly, "you find my family over a fence color you approved yourself. This isn't the first time you've gone after someone over nothing." Another neighbor stood, and another, each recounting their own quiet history with Deborah's selective enforcement, the lost nomination forms, the sudden bylaw discoveries, the fines that materialized only for people who'd crossed her personally. The meeting she called to isolate me was slowly turning into something else entirely. Deborah's composure cracked for the first time in public. "This meeting is about vehicle compliance," she said, voice rising. "Not a referendum on my leadership." But it was too late. Once one person named the pattern out loud, everyone else's private frustrations started connecting into something they could finally see clearly. I stood up, hands shaking slightly, and asked the question I'd been holding on to since the diner. "Deborah, can you explain to everyone here why a bill of sale with my grandfather's forged signature appeared the same week police were told my car was stolen?" The room went dead silent. Her face didn't crack. Not visibly, but her hand tightened around the podium's edge hard enough that I saw her knuckles whiten. "That is currently under police review," she said stiffly. And not appropriate to discuss here. I noted she didn't deny it. She just deflected. A woman near the front I didn't recognize spoke up next. Hesitant. I've heard rumblings about the reserve fund, she said. My husband's on the finance committee for our block, and he mentioned numbers not adding up during the last quarterly review. Is that connected to any of this? Deborah's smile snapped back on so fast it looked mechanical. Every dollar of this community's reserve fund is properly accounted for and reviewed annually, she said. I won't entertain baseless rumors alongside baseless accusations of forgery. She adjourned the meeting minutes later, abruptly, before more questions could surface. As people filed out, several stopped to speak with me quietly, not loudly enough for Deborah to hear, but enough to make clear I wasn't alone anymore. Priya squeezed my arm. You're not crazy, she whispered. Something's been wrong with her for years. Nobody's ever pushed back hard enough before. I drove home that night feeling, for the first time in weeks, like the tide might actually be turning. But I also knew Deborah Ashcroft wasn't someone who backed down when cornered publicly. If anything, being exposed in front of 40 neighbors would only make her more dangerous, not less. I called my father to update him on the meeting. He was quiet for a moment, then said something that made my stomach drop. A finance committee raising concerns about reserve funds, he said. That's not an HOA problem anymore. Maddie. If she's been skimming, that's felony-level embezzlement. I need to make a call. I asked who he was calling. Who happens to work financial crimes now? If there's a paper trail, he'll find it faster and cleaner than either of us poking around ourselves. For the first time, I realized my father wasn't just helping me as a dad anymore. 2 days later, that finance committee member from the meeting, whose name I learned was Grant Doyle, reached out to me directly through the neighborhood app. He said he'd been quietly documenting HOA financial discrepancies for over a year, but had been too intimidated by Deborah to say anything publicly until now. We met at a coffee shop outside the neighborhood, away from prying eyes. Grant showed me spreadsheets he'd compiled from publicly available HOA financial disclosures, comparing reported reserve fund totals against actual bank statements he'd obtained through his committee access. The numbers, over 3 years, were off by roughly $90,000. Every discrepancy routes through a vendor called Whitmore Property Services, Grant said, sliding a printout across the table. Landscaping invoices, maintenance fees, all approved by Deborah personally, all paid to a company registered under her son Cody's name. I thought immediately of the restoration business card still in my kitchen drawer. She's been paying herself, essentially, through her son's shell company, for services that either cost far less than invoiced or weren't fully performed at all, Grant explained. I didn't want to believe it either. But once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. $90,000. Quietly bled out. I asked Grant why he hadn't reported this sooner. He looked down at his coffee. Deborah found out I was a Marine, medically discharged, on disability. She threatened to file noise complaints that could jeopardize my housing assistance status if I ever made trouble. She weaponizes whatever she can find on people. That detail chilled me more than almost anything else so far. This wasn't just a woman obsessed with a car anymore. This was someone who had, for years, systematically studied her neighbors' vulnerabilities, and used them as leverage to keep an entire community too afraid to challenge her authority. I shared everything Grant had given me with my father that night. He went quiet on the phone for a long moment. "This is bigger than the car," he finally said. "Someone embezzling HOA funds through a family shell company, forging a decades-old document, staging a false stolen vehicle report. That's a pattern of a person who thinks she's untouchable." "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," he said, "we let it build properly. If we move too fast, she lawyers up and buries the financial trail before anyone can subpoena it. We need documented, provable evidence, not just suspicion. That takes patience. Even when every part of you wants this over immediately." Patience wasn't easy. Deborah escalated again, this time filing a formal HOA lien against my property, claiming unpaid accumulated fines now totaling nearly $4,000 from every disputed violation she'd issued over the past 2 months, threatening to attach it to my home's title if unpaid. I forwarded the lien notice to Renee's paralegal husband, who confirmed most of the underlying fines had never been properly documented or approved by a legitimate board vote, making the lien almost certainly unenforceable, but fighting it would still require time, money, and stress I hadn't budgeted for. I started keeping a second folder specifically for the financial evidence Grant had given me, separate from my personal harassment documentation, treating them as two connected but distinct threads. My ER training kept surfacing in strange ways. Triage. I kept thinking, handle the most dangerous thing first, stabilize, then treat everything else. Deborah, unaware of how much ground I'd quietly gained, seemed to interpret my silence as retreat. Her notices grew bolder, less careful. One accused me of intimidating board members, referencing my meeting question about the forged bill of sale as though I'd been the aggressor rather than the one defrauded. Cody Whitmore showed up again, this time with an actual purchase contract, pre-filled with my name, offering to settle everything for $40,000 less than the Mustang's appraised value, framing it as generous given the ongoing legal complications surrounding the vehicle. I didn't sign it. Instead, "You're making a mistake," Cody said when I handed it back untouched. "My mom always gets what she wants eventually. Easier for everyone if you just let this happen quietly." I asked him to leave my property. He did, but the threat in his voice stayed with me the rest of the night. I mentioned Cody's comment to my father, who'd started stopping by more frequently under the guise of checking on the car, though we both knew it was really about checking on me. "Easier for everyone," he repeated slowly.
"That's the language of people used to steal."
A week later, my garage camera caught something I hadn't expected. Deborah's Cadillac parked outside my house at nearly midnight, engine off, headlights dark, sitting there for almost 40 minutes before finally driving away. Nothing happened. But the footage unsettled me more than any notice had. I sent the clip to my father immediately. His response came fast: "Don't confront her about this directly. Keep documenting. Violence or intimidation tactics. That strengthens a pattern we can use later. But I don't want you engaging with her alone anymore." Understood. Reluctantly. The lull in Deborah's aggression, to come to learn, never meant peace. It meant she was regrouping, recalculating, waiting for an opening. I didn't know yet what her next move would be, but everyone who'd crossed her path in Willow Creek over the years had learned the same hard lesson eventually. Grant reached out again, this time more anxious than before. "I think she knows I've been digging," he said. "Someone filed a noise complaint against me yesterday. First one in 3 years living here. Feels like a message." I told him to document everything, exactly like I had, and stay careful. My father's contact in financial crimes, a detective named Reyes, agreed to a preliminary informal review of the numbers Grant had compiled, cautioning it would take weeks to formally verify anything through proper banking subpoenas, especially since Deborah controlled which records the HOA voluntarily released versus which required legal compulsion. "These things move slow," my father reminded me during one of our now regular phone calls. "Slower than you want, slower than feels fair. But rushed cases get thrown out on technicalities. And someone like her, with resources and connections, will absolutely lawyer up hard the moment she senses an actual threat." I tried to focus on work during the lull, picking up extra shifts partly for the money and partly for the distraction. 12-hour shifts of genuine emergencies made Deborah Ashcroft's manufactured crises feel almost small by comparison, even when I knew, rationally, that they weren't small at all. 3 weeks passed with relative quiet. No new fines, no forged documents, no tow trucks. Deborah appeared at community events smiling, gracious, playing the wronged leader who'd weathered an unfair public challenge with dignity. Several neighbors seemed to soften back toward her, as if the meeting had never happened. I found that almost more unsettling than open hostility. People have short memories when someone performs contrition well enough, and Deborah performed everything well. I kept documenting anyway, kept the folders growing, kept in touch with Grant and my father, refusing to let the quiet lull me into false security. It was Renee, of all people, who first noticed something during the lull that would matter enormously later. She mentioned, almost in passing, that her cousin worked at the county recorder's office and had processed an unusual filing recently, a quitclaim deed attempt on a property in Willow Creek Estates. "Whose property?" I asked, already feeling my stomach tighten before she even answered. Renee checked her phone. "Cedar Hollow Lane," she said. "Your address. Actually, filed under a Deborah Whitmore, claiming an ownership interest based on a decades-old unpaid debt from your grandfather. It got flagged for review. Thankfully, not processed." I felt the floor shift under me for the second time in this entire ordeal. Not just my car anymore. My house. Deborah wasn't just trying to steal a Mustang out of some old grudge. She was making a calculated attempt to take everything Walt Cole had ever owned. I called my father immediately, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone twice. He listened, then went quiet in a way that scared me more than shouting would have. "She's not just petty," he finally said. "She's building an actual claim, piece by piece. This isn't random anymore." "Maddie, what debt?" I asked, desperate for context. Grandpa never mentioned owing anyone anything. My father exhaled slowly. "I think I know," he said. "Your Uncle Frank. The relationship with Debbie Whitmore decades ago. I remember now. There was a loan. Frank borrowed money from her family for a business venture that failed. Walt co-signed that loan," my father continued, voice tight with the effort of remembering details buried 30 years deep. When Frank couldn't repay it and skipped town, Walt paid off most of it himself to protect the family name, but apparently never finished the final balance before Debbie's family gave up chasing it. That's decades old, I said. Wouldn't that be past any statute of limitations by now? My father agreed it almost certainly was legally unenforceable as an actual debt claim, but that didn't mean Deborah couldn't use the appearance of it to cloud my title, delay things, and pressure me into settling out of exhaustion. People like her don't need to win legally, my father said grimly. They just need to make winning so expensive and exhausting for you that giving up looks easier. That's the entire strategy. Delay, harass, confuse, repeat, until the other person just wants it to stop. I understood, finally, exactly what I was up against. I spent that night going through every document my grandfather had ever kept, searching desperately for any record of that old family debt being fully resolved. Deep in the cigar box, beneath restoration receipts, I found it a canceled check, dated 1994. Memo line reading Whitmore loan paid in full, signed by Debbie Whitmore herself acknowledging receipt. My hands actually shook holding that faded slip of paper. 30 years of buried grudge. And the truth was sitting quietly in a cigar box the entire time, proving Deborah's own mother had confirmed the debt settled decades before her fraudulent quitclaim filing ever existed. I photographed it from every angle, then called my father immediately. "This is huge," he said, studying the photos I'd sent. A signed acknowledgement of payment, in her own handwriting, that alone destroys any claim she tries to make on the house. And it also proves she knew, or should have known, that filing this quitclaim was fraudulent from the start. Detective Reyes, upon hearing about the canceled check, requested a copy formally for the growing case file, noting it strengthened the pattern significantly. Fraudulent property filings are serious, especially layered on top of embezzlement allegations and a fabricated stolen vehicle report, he told my father. This is becoming a real case. I finally allowed myself a small, cautious moment of hope that week, sitting in my kitchen with the canceled check and the growing folder of evidence spread across the table. For the first time since this started, it felt like the truth was accumulating faster than Deborah's lies could bury it. That hope was short-lived. Deborah escalated in a direction none of us had anticipated, filing an actual criminal complaint against me personally, alleging I had threatened her physically during a confrontation at the mailboxes weeks earlier, an encounter that had, in reality, lasted less than 2 minutes. I hadn't threatened her, but she'd apparently gone to Officer Trent Ashcroft, her nephew, directly, rather than filing through normal channels, and somehow a preliminary report had been drafted describing me as aggressive and confrontational toward an elderly community leader. Elderly made me laugh bitterly despite the fear coiling in my stomach. Deborah was 58, hardly frail, and had been the aggressor in literally every documented interaction between us. But on paper, filed by a family member within the department, the framing suddenly carried weight I couldn't easily dismiss. My father's voice, when I called him, had a different edge to it than before, not fear exactly, but a controlled, focused anger I rarely heard from him. Nepotism inside a police report, he said, filed by the officer's own aunt. alleging a physical threat with zero corroborating witnesses or evidence. That's a problem. And not just for you. What do you mean? Not just for me? I asked. He paused. Either knowingly drafted a biased report for his aunt, or he was pressured into it. Either way, that's a conduct issue inside a department, and departments take that seriously when it's brought to the right people's attention. I didn't fully understand what he meant by the right people yet, but I trusted there was a plan forming that I wasn't seeing all of. What I did understand was that Deborah had crossed into genuinely dangerous territory, fabricating a criminal allegation against me, not just a civil or HOA matter. I hired an actual attorney that week. On Renee's recommendation, a sharp woman named Patricia Nunez who specialized in property and harassment disputes. Patricia reviewed my entire folder, the forged bill of sale, the fraudulent quitclaim attempt, the fake violations, the canceled check, and now the false criminal complaint. This is one of the most thoroughly documented harassment campaigns I've seen from a private citizen in years, Patricia said, flipping through pages. Most people don't keep records this clean. It's going to matter enormously once this actually goes to court, or if the county decides to pursue criminal charges against her. Patricia moved quickly to have the false criminal complaint against me formally reviewed by an officer outside Trent's immediate chain, citing an obvious conflict of interest given the family relationship. Within days, the complaint was quietly reclassified as unsubstantiated, insufficient corroborating evidence, effectively killing it before it could go further. Deborah, predictably, didn't take that setback quietly. Her next move arrived 3 days later in the form of a letter from an actual attorney of her own, threatening to sue me for defamation, claiming my public accusations at the HOA meeting had damaged her reputation and standing within the community. Patricia read the letter and actually laughed. "This is a scare tactic. Plain and simple," she said. "You asked a factual question about a forged document at a public meeting. That's not defamation. That's accountability. If anything, this letter just adds another data point to the pattern of intimidation we're building." I started to feel, for the first time, like Deborah's tactics were becoming predictable rather than terrifying. Escalate, threaten, retreat, regroup, escalate again. But predictability didn't make any of it less exhausting. I was working ER shifts on almost no sleep, jumping at every notification, living inside a war I never asked to start. My father visited again that weekend, bringing takeout and, more importantly, an update he'd been holding on to. "Detective Reyes subpoenaed the HOA's full banking records this week," he said. "Given the volume of evidence Grant compiled, the DA's Financial Crimes Unit has officially opened a case. This is moving now. For real. How long until anything actually happens?" I asked, exhausted by months of slow-building tension. "Weeks. Maybe a couple months," he admitted. "White-collar cases take time to build airtight. But Maddie, listen to me, once this moves, it moves fast and hard. Prosecutors don't like sitting on strong embezzlement cases." I asked him, finally, the question I'd been avoiding for weeks. "Dad, be honest with me. Is any of this actually about the car anymore? Or did the car just happen to be the thing that cracked something much bigger open?" He considered that for a long moment before answering. "Honestly," he said, "I think the car was never really the point for her. Not entirely. I think it represented something she felt entitled to and got denied decades ago. And going after it let her feel powerful again in a life where, underneath all the control, she's probably terrified of losing everything. That answer stuck with me more than I expected. It didn't excuse anything Deborah had done, the forgeries, the fraud, the false criminal complaint, the years of quiet intimidation against neighbors like Grant. But it gave the chaos a shape I could finally understand, even if I couldn't forgive it. The following week brought Deborah's most reckless move yet. My garage camera caught her, at 2 a.m., attempting to physically pry open my garage door with what looked like a crowbar, clearly assuming the late hour meant no one would witness it. The motion alert woke me instantly. I watched the live feed from my bedroom, heart hammering, torn between calling the police immediately and simply recording everything as evidence first. I chose both, dialing 911 with one hand while the camera app captured every second of Deborah Ashcroft attempting to break into my garage in the dead of night. By the time patrol officers arrived, 12 minutes later, Deborah was gone, but the footage was unmistakable. Her face clearly lit by the garage motion light, crowbar in hand, working at the door seam before apparently losing her nerve or hearing a neighbor's dog bark and fleeing back to her Cadillac. This time, the responding officers weren't Trent. It was two others, one of whom recognized my father from a joint task force years earlier and treated the footage with immediate seriousness, filing it as attempted breaking and entering, forwarding a copy directly to Detective Reyes given the ongoing related investigation. I called my father the moment the officers left, still shaking. "She actually tried to break in," I said, voice unsteady. "With a crowbar." He was quiet for a beat. "Send me the footage right now," he said. "And then I need you to stay somewhere else tonight." I stayed at Renee's that night, unable to shake the image of Deborah's face, lit up green by the motion sensor, utterly focused on prying open my garage like the car inside was the only thing standing between her and something she desperately needed to reclaim. The attempted break-in changed everything about the pace of the investigation. Detective Reyes, armed now with clear video evidence of attempted burglary layered on top of the embezzlement case, moved to request an emergency search warrant for Deborah's home and Whitmore Property Services business records simultaneously. My father explained the shift to me carefully. Attempted burglary caught on camera is concrete, undeniable, and immediate, he said. It gives them legal grounds to move faster on the financial side too, since it establishes a pattern of escalating criminal behavior tied directly to this specific property dispute. Deborah, apparently unaware her attempted break-in had been caught on camera, continued acting publicly as though nothing unusual had happened, attending a neighborhood beautification meeting the very next morning, smiling for photos posted to the HOA's social media page like the previous night simply hadn't occurred. I found that almost more disturbing than the break-in itself, the sheer compartmentalization, the ability to attempt a felony at 2 a.m. and then pose for a smiling community photo 12 hours later without any visible crack in the performance. Grant, when I told him, wasn't surprised at all. "She's done this for years," Grant said. "Threaten someone privately, then show up publicly acting like the community's biggest cheerleader. People believe the public version because it's the only version most of them ever see. You've just seen more of the real one than most people ever get exposed to." The warrant for Deborah's home was executed 6 days later, early on a Wednesday morning, while I was at work. Priya texted me photos from her window, evidence bags being carried out, Deborah standing on her porch in a bathrobe, arguing loudly with officers as neighbors watched from behind curtains. My father called me the moment he heard preliminary details from Detective Reyes. They found financial records at the house matching Grant's discrepancies almost exactly, he said. Ledgers, some handwritten, tracking payments that never should have existed. And Maddie, they found something else. Files specifically about your grandfather, going back years. What kind of files? I asked. My ER shift forgotten entirely, standing frozen in a supply closet with my phone pressed to my ear. Old correspondence, my father said carefully. Letters between her and your grandfather from decades ago. It looks like she'd been fixated on him, and later on you, for far longer than any of us realized. I asked to see them, and my father, after a pause, agreed it was probably better I understood everything now rather than be blindsided later. What I read that evening reshaped everything I thought I knew about where this obsession had actually started, and just how far back it truly went. The letters, dated across nearly 3 decades, revealed Deborah had been infatuated with my grandfather long before her relationship with my Uncle Frank, and that his rejection of her both romantically, apparently, and later in refusing to sell the Mustang, had wounded something in her that never healed. One letter, written the year my grandfather died, was never sent. In it, Deborah wrote that she intended to make things right eventually, that the Cole family owed her what should have always been mine. I sat with that letter for a long time, feeling less angry and more deeply unsettled. This wasn't really about money, or even entirely about the car anymore. This was decades of resentment calcified into obsession, redirected onto me the moment I inherited the one physical thing that represented everything Deborah felt she'd been denied. A man's attention, his approval, and eventually, his most prized possession. My father, reading my silence over the phone, said gently, "None of that excuses what she did to you, Maddie. Obsession isn't a justification. It's just an explanation for why someone becomes capable of things most people never would. She made every single choice in this herself, every step of the way." I appreciated him saying that, because some part of me had started to feel almost sorry for her, and I needed the reminder that sympathy for someone's pain didn't erase accountability for the damage they'd deliberately, repeatedly chosen to inflict on other people to soothe that pain. The financial records seized from Deborah's home, once fully processed by forensic accountants, revealed embezzlement totaling nearly $130,000. Over 4 years, more than Grant's initial estimate, funneled almost entirely through Cody's shell company under the guise of landscaping and maintenance contracts. Cody, questioned separately, immediately began cooperating once he understood the scope of charges his mother was facing, providing detectives with additional records and admitting he'd known the invoices were inflated but claimed he'd been afraid to refuse his mother's instructions. His restoration business had barely functioned as a real company at all. With the financial case building rapidly, Detective Reyes turned attention back to the forged bill of sale and fraudulent quitclaim filing, comparing the handwriting against samples seized from Deborah's home, including drafts of the forged document showing multiple practice attempts at replicating my grandfather's signature before the final version was produced. I felt something settle in my chest seeing those draft pages. Proof, undeniable and physical, that Deborah had sat somewhere practicing my dead grandfather's handwriting until she got it convincing enough to try stealing his car and threatening my home with it. It was so calculated it almost didn't feel real. My attorney Patricia, briefed on the mounting evidence, told me the forgery and fraudulent filing charges alone, layered onto embezzlement and attempted burglary, put Deborah facing serious felony exposure, likely years in prison if convicted on the full scope of charges the DA's office was now preparing. This is no longer just your case, Patricia reminded me. The DA is building a prosecution around Deborah Ashcroft as a defendant who defrauded an entire community for years, not just you specifically. You're a critical witness, but you're part of something much bigger than the Mustang now. I understood that intellectually, but emotionally it was still, at its core, about my grandfather's car and the home he'd left me. Everything else, the embezzlement, the letters, the decades of resentment, orbited around that one central fact. A woman had tried to take something that was never hers. Deborah, released on bail pending formal charges, was legally barred from contacting me directly under an emergency protective order Patricia had filed immediately following the break-in footage. That didn't stop her from one final, desperate attempt to control the narrative before everything fully collapsed around her. She called an emergency HOA meeting herself, defying the board's attempts to remove her from the agenda, insisting she had critical information the community deserved to hear before false accusations destroyed her reputation permanently. Nearly 60 homeowners showed up this time, word having spread far beyond Willow Creek's usual gossip channels. I almost didn't go, worried it would violate the protective order simply by being in the same room. But Patricia confirmed attending a public HOA meeting wasn't prohibited as long as Deborah didn't approach or address me directly. I went, sitting near the back, Priya and Renee on either side of me. Deborah stood at the podium one final time, visibly thinner, makeup unable to fully mask the exhaustion beneath her eyes, and launched into a speech about being targeted by a jealous conspiracy between disgruntled neighbors and outside police interference. Nobody in the room looked convinced. Several people were recording on their phones. Grant stood up first this time, calm and steady despite months of quiet intimidation. I have 3 years of financial documentation showing exactly where this community's reserve funds went, he said. I'm done being afraid of you, Deborah. Everyone deserves to know the truth about where their HOA dues actually went. The room erupted into overlapping conversation. Dozens of neighbors suddenly demanding answers about fines they'd paid, projects that had never been completed, reserve fund reports that never quite matched what they remembered voting on. Deborah gripped the podium, her carefully constructed composure finally, visibly, beginning to shatter in real time. You have no idea what I've sacrificed for this community, she said, voice cracking, abandoning the prepared speech entirely. 11 years of my life keeping this place beautiful, keeping standards up, and this is how you repay me with accusations, with lawyers, with police showing up at my door. You forged my grandfather's signature, I said, standing up despite every instinct telling me to stay quiet given the protective order's technicalities. You tried to steal my house. You tried to break into my garage with a crowbar. Nobody made you do any of that. You chose every single step. The room went completely silent. Deborah stared at me across the crowded clubhouse, and for just a moment, the mask fell away entirely, Not anger, not wounded pride, but something rawer and more desperate underneath. You don't understand what your grandfather took from me, she said quietly. He didn't take anything from you, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He said no. And instead of accepting that like an adult, you spent 30 years turning it into something that made you believe you were entitled to destroy his family to get what you never earned. Deborah didn't respond. Podium, gathered her folder of prepared notes with trembling hands, and walked out of the clubhouse without another word, past 60 silent neighbors who no longer saw the community leader they'd trusted for over a decade, only the truth beneath her. The board emergency session convened immediately after Deborah left, voted unanimously to suspend her presidency pending the outcome of criminal proceedings, appointing Priya as interim president given her steady presence throughout the entire ordeal. Felt, for the first time in months, like something was actually being set right. I drove home that night in something close to stunned silence, replaying the meeting over and over. It wasn't victory exactly. Not yet. Not with charges still pending and a trial somewhere ahead. But it was the first time the entire community had seen Deborah exactly as she really was. My father called just as I pulled into my driveway, having heard a second-hand account already from Detective Reyes, who'd apparently had an officer quietly present at the meeting given the ongoing investigation. You did good tonight, he said simply. Standing up like that, in front of everyone. That took courage. I just told the truth, I said, exhausted but oddly lighter than I'd felt in weeks. Sometimes, my father replied, that's the hardest and bravest thing a person can do, especially against someone who spent years making sure nobody ever dared to. I sat in my car a long moment after we hung up. The weeks following the meeting moved faster than the previous months combined. Formal charges against Deborah were filed. Felony embezzlement, forgery, fraudulent filing of a property document, and attempted burglary, with Cody facing separate, lesser charges for his role in the shell company scheme once his cooperation was factored in. Trent Ashcroft, meanwhile, faced an internal affairs review over the biased criminal complaint he'd drafted against me at his aunt's request, ultimately resulting in a formal reprimand and reassignment away from Willow Creek's patrol district entirely, a consequence my father confirmed was standard for that kind of conduct violation. I asked my father, during one of our now frequent dinners together, something I'd wondered since this all began. Did you know, this whole time, how connected you'd end up being to this case? Being the police chief, did that change how any of it played out? He considered the question carefully before answering. I stayed out of the direct investigation entirely, on purpose. The second I realized how personal this was, he said. Reyes ran it independently. I made calls. I advocated for it being taken seriously, but I never let my position touch the actual evidence gathering. Why does that matter so much to you? I asked. Because, he said, if this case ever felt tainted by nepotism, the same way Trent's report against you was tainted, it would give her defense attorney an opening to argue the whole thing was personal retaliation rather than legitimate law enforcement. I wasn't going to hand her that. That answer settled something in me I hadn't realized needed settling. My father hadn't used his position to protect me through favoritism. He'd used his knowledge to make sure the case against Deborah was built clean, strong, unimpeachable, precisely so nothing about it could ever be dismissed as personal or political. Grant, meanwhile, found himself unexpectedly thrust into a leadership role within the community, helping the new interim board conduct a full financial audit alongside outside auditors the county recommended, working to trace every dollar that had passed through Whitmore Property Services back to where it should have actually gone. The full audit, completed over 6 weeks, confirmed embezzlement totaling $134,000, precisely matching forensic accountants' earlier estimate. Funds that had funded, among other things, a boat Deborah kept at a marina 40 minutes away and a substantial renovation to her own kitchen, disguised in HOA books as clubhouse improvements. Reading that detail, I actually laughed out loud, alone in my kitchen, at the absurdity of it, years of harassing neighbors over garden gnomes and trash can timing while quietly funding her own granite countertops with money meant for community maintenance everyone else had dutifully paid into, trusting her completely. Priya, as interim president, called a community vote on permanently restructuring the HOA's financial oversight, requiring independent third-party audits annually and mandatory contested elections going forward, ensuring no single person could ever again consolidate the kind of unchecked control Deborah had held for over a decade unopposed. The vote passed overwhelmingly, nearly unanimous, a symbolic and practical closing of the exact door Deborah had walked through years earlier to build her small, cruel empire over Willow Creek Estates. I felt something in my chest loosen slightly, watching a community slowly repair itself piece by piece. As the criminal case moved toward trial, Patricia informed me the DA's office had extended Deborah a plea deal, pleading guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a recommended sentence, avoiding a lengthy, expensive trial that would require dozens of witnesses, including myself, Grant, and nearly a dozen defrauded neighbors. I met with the prosecutor, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diane Castellano, to discuss whether I supported the plea deal or wanted to push for trial. The deal guarantees prison time and full restitution, she explained. Trial guarantees nothing, and drags this out for another year, minimum, with real emotional cost to you. I thought about it for days, torn between wanting Deborah to face a jury of her actual victims and wanting this exhausting chapter of my life to finally, actually end. In the end, I told Diane I'd support the plea deal, on one condition, that Deborah be required to formally allocate, admitting exactly what she'd done, on the record, in open court. Diane agreed the condition was reasonable and negotiable, and 2 weeks later, I sat in a courtroom for the first time since this entire ordeal began, watching Deborah Ashcroft, dressed plainly, stripped of her usual sharp composure, stand before a judge and admit, on the record, to every single charge against her. Her voice was flat, almost mechanical, as she confirmed forging my grandfather's signature, filing a fraudulent quitclaim deed, embezzling community funds through her son's shell company, and attempting to break into my garage with intent to steal the Mustang outright rather than continue pursuing it through legal or coercive means. Hearing her say it plainly, without the manipulative framing she'd used for months, felt strangely anticlimactic and enormously satisfying at the same time. There was no more spin, no more concern for the community, no more wounded innocence. Just the flat, unglamorous truth of what she'd actually done, finally spoken aloud. The judge accepted the plea, scheduling formal sentencing for 6 weeks later, releasing a pre-sentencing report requirement that would factor in restitution amounts, victim impact statements, and Deborah's complete lack of prior criminal history against the sheer scope and duration of what she'd ultimately been proven to have done. I spent those 6 weeks trying to return to some semblance of normal life, working my ER shifts, driving the Mustang openly again for the first time in months without fear of cameras or forged paperwork, slowly letting my nervous system unclench from the constant vigilance I'd been living under. My father and I grew closer during that stretch than we had in years, dinners becoming a weekly habit rather than an occasional obligation. Both of us, I think, needing the reminder that family could mean protection and steadiness rather than just distant, dutiful check-ins across 40 minutes of highway. Grant, once terrified into silence, became something of a quiet local figure of admiration. His methodical documentation credited by the DA's office as the single most important piece of evidence in building the embezzlement case. He told me once, over coffee, that facing Deborah publicly had felt like reclaiming something. For years, I let her convince me I was powerless because of my disability status, he said. Turns out the paperwork I kept out of pure stubborn anger was the exact thing that finally brought her down. Funny how that works. I told him it wasn't funny. It was earned, hard-won, and real. The victim impact statement portion of sentencing approached, and Patricia asked if I wanted to speak, or submit something written instead. I chose to speak, standing in that same courtroom, facing a woman who'd spent months trying to steal my grandfather's memory along with his most treasured possession. On the day of sentencing, the courtroom filled with more familiar faces than I expected. Priya, Renee, Grant, even the Ferraros and Mr. Doyle from the Finance Committee, all there not because they'd been subpoenaed, but because they'd chosen to witness the end of something that had quietly terrorized their community for years. Diane presented the full scope of the case first, the financial records, the forged documents, the attempted burglary footage, the pattern of intimidation against multiple homeowners stretching back years before I ever moved into Willow Creek Estates. Deborah sat motionless throughout, staring at the table in front of her. When it came time for my statement, I stood, hands steadier than I expected, and spoke directly to the judge rather than Deborah, telling him about my grandfather, about the 40 years he spent restoring that Mustang, about the promise a car like that represents to someone who built it with his own hands. She didn't just try to steal a car, I said. She tried to erase the proof that a good, honest man existed and mattered, just because he once told her no. She tried to take my home. She tried to have me arrested for a crime that never happened. She built a fortune on other people's trust. I'm not asking for the maximum sentence out of anger, I continued, glancing briefly at Deborah, who still hadn't looked up. I'm asking this court to recognize that what happened here wasn't a misunderstanding or a family dispute. It was a deliberate, sustained campaign to destroy people who trusted her. For years, unchecked. Grant spoke next, describing the fear he'd lived under, the threats to his housing assistants, the years of silence he'd kept out of survival instinct rather than choice. 2 other neighbors, previously too intimidated to come forward publicly, added their own accounts of fines and threats stretching back nearly a decade. The judge listened to all of it without interruption, occasionally making notes, his expression unreadable throughout most of the proceedings. When it finally came time to address Deborah directly, he set his notes down and looked at her for a long, silent moment before beginning to speak. "Mrs." he said, "what strikes me most about this case isn't the dollar amount, though it's substantial, and it isn't the forgery, though that's serious in its own right. It's the sheer duration and calculation involved. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This was a decade-long pattern of exploiting trust. You held a position meant to serve your community," he continued, "and you used it instead to enrich yourself, intimidate the vulnerable, and when finally challenged, escalated to outright criminal conduct against a private citizen defending property that was legally, unambiguously hers. That escalation is what concerns this court most." He sentenced Deborah to 7 years in state prison, eligible for parole after serving a portion depending on behavior, alongside a restitution order requiring full repayment of the embezzled funds plus damages related to the fraudulent filings and forgery, effectively stripping away most of what she and Cody had accumulated. Cody, having cooperated fully throughout the investigation, received a significantly reduced sentence of probation and community service, along with his own restitution obligations, the judge noting explicitly that his cooperation had materially assisted the prosecution's case while acknowledging he'd still knowingly participated in the fraud for years. I watched Deborah as the sentence was read, waiting for some final flash of the venom I'd grown used to, some parting shot of blame or justification. Instead, she simply closed her eyes, shoulders sagging, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Not a queen bee anymore, just a tired, defeated woman. As bailiffs approached to escort her out, she finally looked up, and for one brief moment, our eyes met across the courtroom. There was no apology in her expression. Not exactly, but something closer to exhausted resignation, as though some part of her finally understood the cost of 30 years of unresolved resentment. I didn't feel triumphant watching her led away in handcuffs, the way I might have expected to months earlier during the worst of the harassment. Mostly, I just felt tired and relieved, and ready to finally exhale a breath I felt like I'd been holding since that first violation notice appeared in my mailbox. My father found me outside the courthouse afterward, and without a word, pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than either of us probably intended. "Your grandfather would be proud of how you handled all of this," he said quietly. "Not just the car. You fought fair the whole time." "I had help," I said, thinking of Grant's spreadsheets, Priya's steady presence, Renee's paralegal husband, Patricia's sharp legal instincts, and my father's careful, deliberate refusal to let his position shortcut a case that needed to stand entirely on its own evidence.
"I couldn't have done any of..."
"That's usually how it works," my father said. "People like Deborah count on isolating everyone around them, making each person feel too small or too afraid to push back individually. The second people start comparing notes, start trusting each other again, that kind of control falls apart fast. You saw that happen firsthand. In the weeks following sentencing, Willow Creek Estates began, slowly, to feel like an actual community again rather than a fiefdom operating under quiet fear. Priya's leadership as permanent HOA president, confirmed unanimously in the first contested election the neighborhood had held in over a decade, brought a lighter, More transparent tone entirely. Restitution payments began arriving to affected homeowners over the following months, funded partly through the sale of assets seized from Deborah and Cody, including, notably, the boat purchased with embezzled funds and a portion of equity forcibly extracted from the Ashcroft home through court order. Grant used a portion of his restitution to finally get proper accessibility modifications made to his home, something he told me he'd been putting off for years, partly out of financial hesitation and partly, he admitted, out of a lingering fear that drawing attention to his needs would invite more of Deborah's targeting. I drove the Mustang to visit him the week his modifications were completed. Top down. No fear of cameras or forged paperwork trailing behind me anymore. Just a quiet Sunday afternoon drive that felt, for the first time in nearly a year, completely and simply ordinary. My mother, hearing the full story finally laid out from beginning to end, admitted she felt a strange mix of guilt and vindication regarding Uncle Frank's old relationship with Debbie Whitmore. Your grandfather always said that woman held onto things longer than anyone should, she said.
I just never imagined.
I thought often, in the months after sentencing, about that unsent letter found in Deborah's home, the one written the year my grandfather died, insisting the Cole family owed her something. I wondered if she'd ever really believed that, or if it was simply the story she needed to justify everything that followed. Patricia told me, during our final meeting to close out the case formally, that, in her experience, people like Deborah rarely saw themselves as villains in their own narrative. She probably genuinely believed, on some level, that she deserved what she was trying to take, Patricia said.
That's what made her so.
I asked Patricia what she meant by dangerous specifically. Because people who know they're doing wrong tend to hesitate, leave gaps, make mistakes born of guilt, she explained. People who've convinced themselves they're righting some old injustice move with total confidence. That confidence is exactly what let her operate unchecked for over a decade. The Mustang, fully restored to its rightful place in my life without complication or threat hanging over it, became something different to me after all of this. Not just a memory of my grandfather anymore, but proof of what happens when you refuse to let someone else's entitlement rewrite the truth of what's actually yours. I started, slowly, attending HOA meetings regularly, not out of obligation but genuine investment in making sure whatever came after Deborah stayed accountable, transparent, and fair. Priya asked me eventually to join the finance committee alongside Grant, a role I accepted, wanting to help build the oversight that should have existed all along. My father retired from active chief duties 18 months later, choosing to stay on in an advisory capacity rather than fully stepping away. And he told me once, over one of our now standard Sunday dinners, that the Ashcroft case had reminded him why he'd gone into this work decades earlier in the first place. Most of the job is procedure, paperwork, patience, he said. But every once in a while, you get to watch the truth actually matter, actually protect someone who did everything right against someone who thought power meant she never had to. That doesn't happen as often as people think. I'm glad it happened for you. I asked him, half joking, if he'd ever tell people at retirement gatherings about the case where his own daughter turned out to be the key witness against a woman who tried to steal her classic car. He laughed. You look as brave as you actually were, he said. Deborah, from prison, sent exactly one letter to me, roughly a year into her sentence. which Patricia advised me I wasn't obligated to read but could if I chose. I read it once, alone in my kitchen. It wasn't an apology. It was mostly a long, meandering justification about entitlement and old wounds. I didn't respond. That hadn't already been said more effectively in a courtroom by a judge who'd looked at 30 years of quiet resentment and called it exactly what it was. Not tragedy, not misunderstanding, but a deliberate, sustained choice to hurt people who trusted her. Cody, completing his community service requirements, eventually moved out of Willow Creek entirely, selling his restoration business's remaining assets and relocating to a different state to, as Priya heard secondhand, start over somewhere nobody knows the family name. I hoped, genuinely, that he meant it, and that it stuck. The house Deborah had lived in for over a decade eventually sold. The proceeds absorbed largely into restitution payments, and a young family moved in. The Alvarez family, with 2 kids and a golden retriever, who brought a warmth to that corner of Cedar Hollow Lane that hadn't existed there in years. I sometimes catch myself driving past that house, thinking about how differently things could have gone if Grant hadn't found the courage to speak up, if my father hadn't recognized a forged signature at a glance, if my grandfather hadn't kept that faded cancel check tucked safely in an old cigar box. Renee told me once that she thought the whole ordeal had changed me, made me sharper, more guarded in some ways. I told her she wasn't wrong, but that it had also, strangely, made me more willing to trust people who'd earned it. Priya, Grant, Patricia, my father, in ways I hadn't before. 2 summers after the sentencing, Willow Creek Estates held its first genuinely joyful community event in years. A block party celebrating the neighborhood's newly restructured, transparent HOA, complete with a classic car showcase that Priya insisted I headline. The Mustang parked proudly in the center of the cul-de-sac. Kids from the neighborhood, the Alvarez children included, crowded around the car asking questions about the engine, the paint, the history, and I found myself telling them about my grandfather with a lightness I hadn't felt in speaking about him since this entire ordeal began nearly 2 years earlier. My father showed up to that block party too. Off-duty, in jeans instead of a uniform for once, and stood beside the Mustang with me for a long while, quietly proud, watching neighbors who'd once been too afraid to speak up now laughing together over potato salad and lawn chairs. You know, he said, watching the scene unfold, your grandfather would have loved seeing this car surrounded by kids instead of locked away in a garage out of fear someone might try to steal it. I agreed. Felt, finally, like the Mustang belonged fully to the life it was always meant to be part of. Grant, now walking with far more ease thanks to his home modifications, brought a folder to the block party too, half joking, half serious, containing the first fully transparent annual financial report the HOA had produced in over a decade, printed and available for any resident who wanted a copy. No questions asked. Feels good, he said, handing me a copy, watching people actually trust the numbers again. I told him it felt good watching him stand in a crowd without flinching, something I'd noticed he still occasionally did in the earliest months after Deborah's arrest. Old fear taking time to fully unclench its grip. Priya, addressing the block party briefly before the food was served, thanked the community for weathering a difficult chapter without naming Deborah directly. choosing instead to focus forward on the transparency and mutual accountability the neighborhood had built together in the aftermath. Nobody needed her to say the name. Everyone remembered, I thought, watching that crowd, about how differently my father had once described Deborah's motive. A woman terrified of losing everything, who chased control because control felt like the only armor she had left against old humiliation. I still didn't excuse it, but I understood. Finally, that fear curdled badly left unchecked. The restitution fund, fully distributed by that second summer, allowed the HOA to complete several long-delayed community projects Deborah had claimed for years were underfunded. A renovated playground, repaired sidewalks, updated clubhouse wiring, tangible proof of exactly how much had been quietly stolen from ordinary, trusting neighbors for so long. I never fully stopped thinking about my grandfather during any of this, but standing at that block party, watching kids climb carefully, supervised, into the Mustang's front seat for photos, I felt something settle that had been unsettled since the day that first violation notice appeared folded in my mailbox. The car had survived. The truth, eventually, had survived, even against someone who'd spent decades building an entire persona designed to bury it. I drove home that evening, top down, the whole neighborhood behind me lit gold with early evening sun, feeling lighter than I had in years. My father called that night, as he often did after significant days, just to check in. "Good day?" he asked. "The best one in a long time," I told him honestly. We talked for a while about nothing important, work, whether he should finally replace his ancient truck, the easy kind of conversation. Before hanging up, he added one more thing. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm proud of how you handled every part of this. Not just fighting back. Knowing when to be patient, when to trust the process, when to let the evidence speak instead of your anger. That's not easy." I thought about that compliment long after we hung up, recognizing it as one of the truest things anyone had said to me throughout the entire ordeal. This had never really been about winning against Deborah out of spite. It had been about protecting the truth of who my grandfather was and who I chose to be. A year after that block party, Grant ran for HOA vice president himself, encouraged by neighbors who'd come to trust his steady, transparent presence on the finance committee, and won easily, unopposed by anyone genuinely wanting the role rather than because opposition had been quietly discouraged the way it once had been. Priya, still president, told me during one meeting that Willow Creek had received inquiries from 2 neighboring HOAs asking how they'd managed to root out embezzlement and rebuild transparency so thoroughly. "Funny," she said, "how a story that started with a stolen car ended up fixing an entire broken system. I still saw Cody's name occasionally in restitution paperwork updates, his payments arriving reliably, if slowly, from wherever he'd relocated to. Patricia told me his cooperation and consistent compliance had, at least, kept him from further legal consequences, something she considered a reasonable, if imperfect, outcome given his role in everything. The Mustang needed minor maintenance that spring, and I took it, deliberately, to a small independent mechanic across town rather than any restoration business remotely. Connected to the Whitmore name, watching an old craftsman carefully tune the engine my grandfather had rebuilt decades earlier with obvious, genuine respect for the work, Cars like this, the mechanic said, wiping his hands on a rag. They carry stories. You can tell when someone actually loved building something versus someone who just wanted to own it. I told him he had no idea how true that was, and left it there, unwilling to relive the whole story yet again. Renee asked me once, nearly 2 years after everything had settled, whether I regretted ever moving into Willow Creek Estates at all, given everything it had put me through. I told her, honestly, no, because staying, fighting, and winning had given me something leaving quietly would never have, proof that standing firm actually mattered. Deborah remains in state prison as of this writing, eligible for parole consideration in a few more years. Her name mostly forgotten now by newer residents of Willow Creek who only know the neighborhood as it exists today. Transparent, contested elections, audited finances, a community that finally actually protects its own. The house I grew up visiting, the garage my grandfather spent 40 years perfecting an engine in, still stands exactly where it always has, and the Mustang still sits in that same driveway most evenings. Uncovered now, unafraid, because there's nothing left to hide it from anymore. I still work ER shifts, still keep in close touch with Grant and Priya, still have dinner with my father most Sundays, and I still, occasionally, drive that Mustang down Cedar Hollow Lane just to feel the engine my grandfather built humming steady beneath me. Proof that some things survive exactly because people fight for them. Willow Creek Estates today looks, on the surface, almost exactly like it did before any of this happened. Matching mailboxes, manicured lawns, quiet cul-de-sacs. But underneath, everyone who lived through it knows the difference. A community that learned, the hard way, what unchecked power quietly does when nobody dares to push back. My father says, sometimes, that the best cases aren't the dramatic ones people remember from television, but the quiet ones where ordinary people simply refuse to be bullied into silence, where patience and evidence eventually outlast intimidation. I think about that every time I turn my key in that old Mustang's ignition. Grant still keeps meticulous records, out of habit now rather than fear, joking that Deborah accidentally taught the whole neighborhood the value of paying close attention to where their money actually goes. Priya still runs contested elections every single year, refusing to let complacency creep back into the system they rebuilt together. And I still have that faded canceled check from 1994, framed now, hanging in my garage beside a photo of my grandfather standing proudly next to his brand new Mustang in 1971, 2 pieces of paper, decades apart, that together outlasted a woman who spent 30 years trying to erase what they both proved true. People ask me sometimes if I ever expected any of it, the forged documents, the false arrest, the courtroom, the sentencing, discovering my own father's quiet, careful integrity in refusing to let his position shortcut justice. I tell them no. Honestly, nobody expects a fight like that over a parked car. But I also tell them this, sometimes the smallest, most stubborn refusals to sell a car, to hand over a house, to stay silent under pressure, end up cracking open truths far larger than anyone involved could have possibly imagined when it all began with one folded notice in a mailbox. The Mustang still runs perfectly. My grandfather's promise still holds. And Willow Creek Estates, finally, belongs to the people who actually live there.